Good morning. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Many thanks to the Freer Sackler for hosting this and to the Lunder Consortium for sponsoring it. Can you hear me all right? Not very well? Better? Better. Many thanks also to the Terra Foundation, who continues to sponsor my work, and a special note of thanks to Margaret McDonald and Linda Merrill, without whose exhaustive investigations into Whistler's patronage relationships and the entire scope of Whistler's art worlds, the kind of scholarship that I practice, could not be done. When novelist and friend of the artist Arthur Symons penned his eyewitness account of James McNeill Whistler's Peacock Room in 1905, he used language that, while familiar to us, sounds startlingly anachronistic for the period. "Every inch of the wall," he wrote, "ceiling, wainscoting, the doors, the frames, the shutters, was worked into the scheme, woven together into a web or network of almost alarming loveliness." Following Symons' cue, this presentation aims to turn the Peacock Room as a palace of art inside out. Instead of approaching it as a retreat of godlike isolation, I will use it as a starting point from which to highlight the aesthetic movement's aspects of interconnection, organic expansion, and systematic organization. In short, its networked character. Placed alongside and shot through with the other networked social, technological, and economic systems that structured turn-of-the-century English and American life, aesthetic paintings and interiors reveal themselves to be facilitators of the coordinated manipulation of things and the cooperative relationships between people upon which all of these systems depended. In recent years, the field of Whistler studies has taken a strong turn toward the science of the painter's practice, underscoring his particularly methodical pursuit of an art for art's sake, or, as Elizabeth Predijon has usefully reframed the question, the problem of what art might be if it is not for the sake of anything else. In the case of The Princess, Whistler conflates, almost completely, the practice of arranging objects and models into a studio display, and that of choosing and placing lines, shapes, and colors on canvas to create a painted composition. From the diagonal notes of warm rose that playfully skip across robe, fan, and screen, to the threads of blue and gray tones that weave together carpet, gown, and vase, Whistler gives us a glimpse into life and art configured as a perfectly harmonious system. The painting's alternate titles, variations in flesh color, gray and blue, arrangement in flesh color and gray, even more explicitly direct our attention to the artist's mandate to pick and choose and group with science the colors and forms of nature until he brings forth from chaos glorious harmony. And although each artist associated with the aesthetic movement approached the art for art's sake question differently, this emphasis on interlinked and systematic arrangement may be the single factor that unites them all, as it unites these three pictures from the collection of Frederick Leyland, a shared conviction that the painting, in the words of the 19th century critic Cosmo Monkhouse, is essentially an organized whole in which the beauty of each thing should interweave with the beauty of every other thing, and the result should be a harmony of many beauties. As the juxtaposition of these pictures makes clear, aesthetic paintings do not only construct tightly cohesive systems within the boundaries of their frames, they also have a tendency to branch out, to extend themselves laterally. These three artists' commitment to purified compositional harmony prioritizes surface arrangement over deep perspectival space. Cropped objects and banded stratification of foreground and background create a horizontal thrust that extends beyond the edge of the canvas, but also snaps the pictures back against the wall, rendering them flat, modular, in a word, decorative. Paintings like The Princess serve as both condensed models of coordinated interiors and keystones around which fully three-dimensional aesthetic spaces can be realized, indeed must be realized, as their contents have been so carefully interwoven as to risk fatal compromise by inharmonious hanging. And it was, famously, the lack of fit that Whistler perceived between the subtle variations of the princess and her installation environment in Frederick Leyland's London dining room that prompted him to develop the Peacock Room concept, which rapidly overwrote Thomas Jekyll's original decorative program for the space, even at the expense of permanently alienating Leyland as a patron and friend. As Linda Merrill's history of the room suggests, despite their disagreements, Leyland did receive what he had wanted in the first place, a completely coordinated social space, one of many he had orchestrated and financed with the profits of his merchant shipping enterprise. The Peacock Room was different in degree, but not, I would argue, in concept, from the William Morris papered parlors of his Liverpool estate, the Burne-Jones decorated dining room at his Queensgate residence, or the symmetrical pairings of Rossetti heads he commissioned for the Prince's Gate Music Room. And this is where Arthur Symons' use of the word network to describe the Peacock Room's aesthetic interweavings is particularly suggestive, because Leyland's professional life was completely devoted to the creation and management of complex networked systems, and his personal life, carried out within these harmoniously coordinated walls, bears the marks of strategic negotiation that we now commonly refer to as social networking. In both of these senses, Leyland was thoroughly representative of late 19th century self-made businessmen generally, and of Whistler's English and American patrons more specifically. As the owner and manager of the Leyland line, Frederick Leyland was enmeshed in an ocean transport system that, much like the railroad systems rapidly overspreading the surface of the globe, was so complex in its reticulations that Victorian commentators increasingly found themselves reaching for the metaphors of fishing and embroidery networks to capture its scale and scope. Overlaid upon and intersecting with these transit systems were equally complex communications technologies, networks of telephone and telegram, in Whistler's words, that were linking point to point across the Western world. These were the essential threads through which empires were knitted together. Close analysis of late 19th century English and American discourse indicates that with the proliferation of concrete, tangible systems, the network metaphor launched into a more broadly conceptual realm, evidence of a world alive to the possibilities of increased interconnection. By 1906, it was reasonable for William James to observe that men are conjoined in a vast network of acquaintanceship. Brown knows Jones, Jones knows Robinson, and by choosing your farther intermediaries rightly, you may carry a message from Jones to the Empress of China, or the chief of the African Pygmies, or anyone else in the inhabited world. Coping with these changing conditions, not to mention harnessing them for financial gain, required learning to toggle between the micro and the macro, understanding how interlocked pieces fit together into arrays almost too extensive to conceptualize. Business handbooks of the era are filled with meditations on system, order, and harmony. Among the responsibilities of steamship owners like Leyland, according to one Victorian shipping guide, were the carriage of freight, the fixing of the sailing schedules, and the 1,001 details which must be fully worked out with various connections scattered throughout the world. But for Leyland, one of the most pressing issues was achieving a correct and balanced stowage of a wide range of largely perishable materials in order to keep his steamships from turning over or running aground. Representing the Liverpool Steamship Owners Association in testimony before the House of Commons in 1880, Leyland explained with detailed statistical precision the problems of ship overloading, and advised that this risk could be reduced if all steamers were to follow his example and subdivide their cargo holds into smaller compartments to prevent grain and other ballast from shifting in transit. On another occasion, when Boston's dock workers struck for higher wages, Leyland was forced to decide whether they could be replaced by untrained laborers with no experience in selecting, stacking, and balancing cargo in precisely the right order. Leyland's success as a ship owner quite literally depended upon his ability to achieve harmonious arrangements of various parts. We might reconsider then Charles Augustus Howell's complaint that Leyland was never taken with the beauty of a certain pot or anything. He only sees that such and such a corner requires a pot, and then he orders one. It is worth asking whether Leyland's tendency to order heads from Rossetti based on the rhythmic patterns they might form on the walls of his home tells us something about Leyland as a particularly clinical, even cynical collector, or rather underscores the fundamentally system-oriented, modular, and manipulable character of aesthetic paintings and interiors in and of themselves. Also worth noting in relation to Leyland's shipping career is the fact that so many Whistler paintings, including these two from the Leyland collection, speak a language of cosmopolitanism, often Japanisme, in both form and content, testifying eloquently to the comings and goings of things in global transit, extending even to the representations of ports and harbors in which these exchanges occur, as Robin Spencer has noted. As an evocative supplement to these visual catalogs, English trade journals from the 1870s and 1880s track the frequency and diversity of exports and imports in which Leyland's line played an instrumental role. Eclectic cosmopolitanism is one route through which we might approach aestheticism as an art that reaches out rather than one that turns inward. Electricity is another. Theodore Child's description of Prince's Gate in 1890 included stars of electric lights among the gas pendant lamps in the Peacock Room. They were undoubtedly Edison Swan bulbs, as Leyland served as a director and deputy chairman of the company from 1884. His work for Edison Swan involved streamlining and economizing finances, tracking complex patent litigation, and negotiating the placement of wiring systems to prevent their interference with other network technologies. Through Leyland and his associates, we begin to see a clearer picture of the interpenetration of electrical and aesthetic systems at the turn of the century. One of Edison Swan's largest contracts involved supplying bulbs to the premier showcase for aesthetic painting in London, the Grosvenor Gallery. Although the electrification of the gallery, indeed its transformation into one of London's first electrical power stations, is a story well known to technological historians, it usually only serves as a footnote in art historical accounts. But Sir Coutts Lindsay, proprietor of the Grosvenor, installed a small generator there as early as 1883, and by 1885 had enlarged the electrical plant to provide power to nearby residents and businesses using an overhead house-to-house system that linked them in extended chains. The gallery became a showplace for the new technology, as when Lindsay hosted a special private view for artists, including Lawrence Alma-Tadema and Frederick Leighton, alongside investors, engineers, and journalists, to compare the effects on the pictures of gas jets blazing in one room against those of electric lamps glowing in the other. The implications of this intersection of the aesthetic and the electrical were potentially technological and social. Also connected to the Bond Street power grid was the artist and engineer W.A.S. Benson, whose cousin was Coutts Lindsay's partner in the Grosvenor Gallery electrical venture. Benson's electrical fixtures featured organic designs that naturalized the new technology and blended it seamlessly into the aesthetic homes he wired and decorated. Electricity, in a way, enabled artistic home decoration to achieve its ultimate goals. Mary Eliza Haweis had urged her readers in 1881 to remember that a room is like a picture, it must be composed with equal skill and forethought, and that furnishing ought to be carried out on some sort of system. Electricity bestowed upon the householder complete freedom to arrange the parts within this composition or system anywhere he or she chose. As one electrician explained in 1888, with the incandescent lamp, unlike gas, there are no restrictions of placing for fear of burning or soiling or heating the things in juxtaposition. Tables, walls, ceilings, tapestry, pictures, all alike are safe, only the best effect is to be considered. In addition to serving as an electrical showcase, the Grosvenor Gallery was also a social showplace, as much recent scholarship has emphasized. Often lost in discussions of aestheticism, fashion, and status, however, has been the real, practical value of the social networking that occurred in aesthetic spaces. The lighting of the Grosvenor Gallery confirms that the venue drew together individuals whose cultural tastes and investment interests overlapped. Leyland and his partner in electricity, James Stotts Forbes, shared a taste for Whistler's paintings and both loaned works to the Grosvenor on various occasions. They also shared corporate leadership of the same electrical and telephone companies, and the close friendship between them was noticed, sometimes disparagingly, by other board members. Leyland so frequently seconded Stotts Forbes' recommendations at Edison Swan that shareholders began to complain of a lack of transparency created by the family arrangement between the two of them. Their objection points to another characteristic of the networked 19th century, an increasing suspicion that the effectiveness of public and official procedural systems might be undermined by networks of cliquism and favoritism, networks of secret societies, and other mechanisms through which power was concentrated in closed circles behind closed doors. What role did aesthetic interiors play in this type of social networking? Leyland did not have a separate office in London. Surely he and Stotts Forbes occasionally discussed their networked business ventures while surrounded by Leyland's carefully coordinated aesthetic and technological arrangements. We can only speculate about Stotts Forbes, but in the case of Sir Thomas Sutherland, friend to Leyland and Whistler, Minister of Parliament and chairman of the Peninsular and Oriental Steamship Company, we have at least one business associate whose presence in the Peacock Room can be confirmed. Sutherland told the Pennells that he knew Leyland well and worked with him often, and had visited his houses in Liverpool and London and saw the Peacock Room for himself. He credited Leyland with introducing him to Whistler, and he served both as the trustee managing the Leyland's legal separation and as the chairman of Whistler's bankruptcy committee. Sutherland was a guest at the artists' breakfasts and a purchaser of at least two of his paintings, and at one point even asked him to draw up a decorative program for his home that may have resembled the scheme for Whistler's own White House with its yellow parlor. Again, in Sutherland, we encounter a patron particularly drawn to Whistler's systematic interiors and serial paintings, who was also one of the premier network builders of his age. At his death in 1922, the Times observed that he took a more active part than probably any other man of his time in the expansion of that network of communication with both the Far East and Australia, which has exercised so important an influence on our commerce and our empire. He was the founder of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, now known as HSBC, a lead negotiator in the opening of the Suez Canal to British shipping interests, and a chairman of a major steamship line tasked with carrying passengers, cargo, and the British mail. Sutherland, like Leyland, understood the social value of aesthetic design. He deployed it in at least 12 ships commissioned by the Peninsular and Oriental Steamship Company in the 1880s and 90s. Through the architects Wallace and Flockhart and Thomas E. Colcutt, Sutherland, as chairman of the P&O, ordered thousands of tiles from aesthetic ceramicist William de Morgan for the first-class salons, smoking rooms, and corridors of his passenger steamers, and was personally involved in their decoration to the point of becoming, in de Morgan's words, a highly meddlesome, pragmatic body. As design historian David Brett has provocatively suggested, De Morgan's designs for P&O gave their first-class passengers the experience of a floating aesthetic movement. But what was the nature of that experience? Naturally, they served as markers that stratified the passenger traffic into various classes of clientele, and as new ships were opened to tours for the public and the press, decorated spaces served as colorful advertisements for the line. In their eclectic exoticism, they conceptually mapped out the eastern routes of the ships and hinted at the cargo they carried. But of equal, though perhaps less obvious importance, they served as a frame for the social, political, and corporate networking that took place among the select circle that called themselves first trippers. The first trippers were the exclusive list of invitees to join Sutherland for the P&O's weekend-long trial trips, opportunities to test each luxury vessel's speed and comfort before it was deployed in the company's service. Parliamentary observer Henry Lucy was a frequent guest among the first trippers, which included, in his telling of it, hard-worked statesmen, judges, barristers, painters, and men of letters, some of whom set aside business rivalries and partisan political disputes in order to socialize and indulge in the hospitality offered on board. Food, drink, and entertainment flowed freely, leading to such after-dinner hijinks as Sutherland and Sir John Aird, collector of aesthetic painting and builder of the Aswan Dam, doing a sword dance on deck in the moonlight. On these occasions, De Morgan's tile work formed an elegant, interconnected background framing these aesthetic salons, hosted by Sutherland, who was known in his business affairs for advocating cooperation rather than competition as the key to success, so assiduously, in fact, that he was eventually called to testify about his participation in price-fixing schemes before his fellow parliamentarians. Even those not directly involved in establishing cooperative arrangements with Sutherland found in the trial trips ample proof of his managerial skill. Enormous organization, truly, mused one first tripping journalist as he surveyed the extent of the P&O's operations, all dependent upon the supervision of the company's office at Leadenhall Street, and all working in one harmonious whole. Whistler, as it turns out, was also among the first trippers. One weekend, while Whistler was negotiating with Leyland over the Peacock Room, he and a few of his friends were invited to join Sutherland on a trial voyage departing from Southampton, expenses paid. Shortly after that adventure, Whistler painted a picture that memorialized the night they embarked, perhaps something quite similar to this nocturne of Southampton. Sutherland declined to purchase it, but the entire incident draws at least one of Whistler's ethereal nocturnes into a surprisingly concrete, networked context. This nocturne in black and gold may or may not be the nocturne that Sutherland declined. It eventually set sail across the Atlantic and found its way into the hands of railroad car builder Charles Lang Freer, who passionately shared the works of his favorite artist with his closest business collaborators. An incredibly moving letter from William K. Bigsby, St. Louis capitalist and president of the American Car and Foundry Company, eloquently captures the social and aesthetic experience of viewing Whistler's in Freer's Detroit home. I shall never forget the wonderful days I spent at 33 Ferry with you, and can close my eyes and go to those days when, seated in your home with a glass of scotch, we saw your Whistler, the semi-nocturne, perform its stunt of being 5 different pictures in 12 hours, depending on light and shade. I can close my eyes and see the Whistlers, the prints, the screens, the Peacock Room. It has all been a glorious memory and an inspiration. Acquired by Freer 12 years after Leyland's death, the Peacock Room was transported first to Detroit and later to Washington, D.C. for permanent installation. Instead of serving as a dining room, it functioned primarily as a frame for Freer's Asian potteries, as well as for his self-presentation as the anti-Leyland, the patron who stretched to accommodate the artist's wishes and preserve his legacy in every possible way. If the Whistler-Leyland relationship had infamously exploded in a hail of flying peacock feathers, Freer hoped instead to cultivate harmony, and harmony was the watchword of his art collection, business practice, and domestic life. Freer and Bigsby urged the use of Freer's aesthetic Detroit home as a place in which to finalize delicate business negotiations, including the price-fixing agreements that led to the formation of the American Car and Foundry Company, a massive railroad car-building trust engineered by Freer and his associates in 1899. Even a decade before the Peacock Room arrived on American shores, Freer had fully embraced Whistler's totalizing approach to aesthetic experience and home decoration, employing Dwight Tryon and Thomas Wilmer Dewing to create series of related canvases and tone the walls of his great hall and parlor to match them in shimmering opalescent shades of blue, green, and silver. As Freer and his artists repeatedly emphasized in their letters, their overall goal was to harmonize this space, and it in turn became the crucible for the harmonization of competing interests during this period of merger mania and interlocking directorates. Freer represents one extreme case of systems management in which the organizational skills required to run a large railroad car-building concern were applied with equal fervor to the organization of an art collection. His generous gift to the nation came with a number of limiting conditions, as you know, to preserve the collection, in Freer's words, as a harmonious whole. His planning of the Freer Gallery in the years before his death extended even to considerations of symmetrical hanging. Among his gifts was the Peacock Room. The Peacock Room, as an aesthetic artifact, was truly singular, but its installations were multiple, and the comparative configurations it offered endlessly extensible. I want to close with this thought. Because the particular concept of beauty that Whistler and so many of his contemporaries chose to preserve was iterative, comparative, and conceptualized as variations on set themes, these works of art, however closely associated with a discourse of retreat and withdrawal, necessarily reach out, extend, creating a network of highly self-aware patrons who understood their collections as nodes in larger arrays. Largely drained of narrative and sentiment, these paintings became particularly susceptible to other associations, like the ties of friendship Bixby so tenderly recalled. And their thorough integration into the business world, into the lives of their American system builders, gives these pictures and these close ties both organizational and potentially ideological weight. Thank you.